CD2. The small bay soon had a name, Sydney Cove. It seemed made according to a different logic from the world Rook knew. There were trees, as there were in other places, but each was stranger than the last. Some were mops, with a bare pole for a trunk and a bush of foliage 20 feet above the ground. Gnarled pink monsters twisted arthritic fingers into the sky. The squat white trees growing by the stream were padded with bark that flaked in soft sheets like paper. Red parrots sidled along branches, chattering and whistling. Could they be taught to talk, he wondered, or learn a tune, like the one old Captain Vere had in his parlour in Portsmouth? Catching one would be the first difficulty. The birds watched him sideways, cannily. Birdlime or a net? He had no birdlime, no net. And he could whistle a tune for himself, although he had to admit that there was something about these woods of New South Wales that made a man fall silent. Buxtehude seemed another species here, the dialogue of a fugue from another world. Even the rocks were not like any others he had seen, monstrous plates and shards piled haphazardly on each other. How might he describe them to Anne? Thinking of her face, the look she had as she listened to him, her head tilted, her eyes watching him, patient while he found words, he remembered the French pastry he had eaten with her at the tea shop in St. George's Street a few days before the fleet sailed. Layers of pastry interleaved with layers of custard. It was somewhat along the same lines as the stony parts of this landscape. It had been impossible to eat, the custard squirting out at each mouthful. He and Anne had begun by being embarrassed, but ended by laughing at each other's efforts. My dear Anne, I find myself in a land remarkably like the pastry we had that day at Pennycook's, that needed to be eaten in private. In other respects, it is a dry and stony place. He pictured her reading it in the little parlour. He hoped it would make her smile. Within a day of the fleet dropping anchor, the work parties of prisoners had begun to hack at the bushes and trees. 2 weeks later, the head of the cove was a clutter of bleeding timber, scraped yellow earth and tents that tilted and sagged. As soon as a large enough piece of ground was cleared, the population was assembled for the Commodore to address it. He was given a sea chest to stand on in the shade of a sprawling tree, and the prisoners were herded onto the rocky ground in front of him. They shuffled and muttered, indifferent to the significance of the moment. The redcoats made a ragged circle around them. In round numbers, 800 prisoners, 200 marines. Now that they were off the ships, it seemed to Rook that the mathematics of control were precarious. Major Wyatt, his thrust-out jaw making him look somewhat like a carp, stood in a blaze of gold braid. His face was tilted up towards the Commodore beside him on the chest, but Rook could see his eyes flicking, watching the prisoners. He had distributed the 3 captains of Marines at equal distances around the perimeter of the crowd. Rook saw Silk, somehow contriving to stand at attention while looking as relaxed as a man about to step into a dance. Rook had not met Captain Gosden until they landed in New South Wales, but he thought the man should never have been accepted for the expedition. His face was pouchy, pale but for hectic spots high on his cheeks, and it cost him a visible effort to hold himself straight. As usual, he had his handkerchief in his hand and the preoccupied gaze of a man trying not to cough. Silk had amused Rook by describing the 3rd captain, Lennox, as a human string bean. Lennox and his musket stood together, 2 long, thin military machines waiting to do their duty. Rook sweated into his red jacket. The humid air held the heat, and the blue sky beat down headachy light. He could feel his eyes squinting against it, envied Gilbert in his patch of shade. Barton and Gardner and the other naval officers had come ashore in their best blue coats for the ceremony and stood watching. They were simply onlookers. They would sail away again before long. For a moment Rook wished that he were one of them. When Wyatt shouted his order, Rook adopted the regulation stance for the salute, musket against his shoulder, left foot forward. As he pulled his finger back against the trigger and braced himself for the noise, he had a moment's nausea. The volley of shots rang out, a little more ragged than Major Wyatt would no doubt have liked. A flock of big white parrots erupted out of a tree nearby. They heeled and flapped over the humans gathered by the stream, making harsh metallic noises, somewhat in sympathy with the ringing that the gunfire had awoken in Rook's head. He lowered the musket and stood it upright beside him. How happy he would be if today, the 7th of February, 1788, were the last time he ever fired it. The Commodore strained himself upright on his box, shouting to make himself heard against the parrots. He read aloud his commission from King George III, in which, between one word and the next, James Gilbert became monarch by proxy. Like His Majesty, the brand new Governor of New South Wales had been granted the power of life and death over his subjects. Every time Governor Gilbert uttered the name of His Majesty, from some anonymous place within the restless mass of prisoners, there was the unmistakable sound of a hawk and spit. The white parrots flew off, and there was silence in the little valley. On behalf of His Majesty, the Governor proclaimed sovereignty over the territory called New South Wales, and for the first time it was given a shape and size. North to south, it extended between latitude 10 degrees 37 minutes and latitude 43 degrees 49 minutes. East to west, it contained all the land between where they presently stood and 135 degrees of longitude east. Rook applied his mind to some interesting mental arithmetic. 33 degrees of latitude was a distance north to south of over 2,000 miles. 16 degrees of longitude represented about 800 miles east to west. At a rough estimate, His Majesty had just acquired a plot double the size of France, Spain, and Germany combined. Governor Gilbert was still reading. "The natives are on all occasions to be treated with amity and kindness," he shouted above the increasing swell of sound from the prisoners. Some small object flew out of the middle of the crowd towards him and fell into a bush nearby. "It is of the utmost importance to open friendly intercourse with them," he pressed on. "Without their cooperation, the progress and even the existence of this colony will be threatened. His Majesty has instructed me to establish good relations with the greatest possible dispatch, and to become familiar with the native tongue as swiftly as opportunity may make possible." This was an aspect of New South Wales that Rook had not considered. The colony needed an astronomer, but it might also need a linguist. It was true that, in the 2 weeks since the day of beads and looking-glasses, the natives had appeared only once or twice, and then fleetingly. Rook had been on board each time and not seen them. He had glimpsed figures across the port on the opposite shore, smoke rising from various distant points, and canoes silhouetted against the bright water. But so far there had been no opportunity to show the natives amity and kindness. It seemed to Rook that the Governor was hurrying to bring the assembly to a close. "I ask that you kneel with me now," he cried. "The Reverend will give thanks on behalf of us all. Kindly step up, Mr. Pullen." From the crowd a female voice guffawed. "Thanks! Thanks for what?" He thought he recognized the voice of a handsome, foul-mouthed woman who, off Rio, had been dunked in the sea to quieten her. She set them all off now, the prisoners on their feet, shouting and whistling, threatening to overrun the line of Marines. Rook steeled himself to do his duty, but Wyatt spoke to Lennox with a twitch of an eyebrow, and Lennox waded into the crowd. The prisoners must have been familiar with the captain. Lennox had only to lay about him briefly with the butt of his gun, and they subsided, so that Rook was not obliged to do any more than grip his musket and look alert. But there would be other times, he thought, endless other times when every man in a red coat would be required to act. On the voyage, he had established his distinction from the other Marines. He must continue as he had begun. The western headland of the cove had a high remote look that might suit an observatory. or would certainly suit a man who had no wish to play the part of prison guard. He would investigate it as soon as he could and make sure that Lieutenant Rook was seen to be too busy with the celestial bodies for any terrestrial duty. The Reverend was up on the box now, unwinding his usual endless flowery prayer. For his homily, he had taken a line from Psalms, "What shall I render unto the Lord for all his benefits toward me?" Rook thought it might have been especially selected to provoke a congregation of men and women who had no choice about being in a place where benefits promised to be thin on the ground. The governor's face was entirely without expression as he listened, but Rook thought he saw more tightness than usual in his narrow jaw. When the Reverend paused for a breath, the governor was ready. "Amen," he announced, and Pullen was obliged to move on to the benediction. The assembly dispersed. The work parties were chivied back to their axes and picks. Rook slipped away, avoiding the eye of anyone who might call, "Oh, Lieutenant Rook, might I trouble you to give me some assistance here?" To get to that promising headland, though, he had to pass the space being cleared on the western side of the stream. Major Wyatt referred to it as the parade ground, although as yet it was nothing more than a slope of grey dirt bristling with stumps. Walking briskly, as if on some urgent errand, Rook heard the Major's unmistakable roar and saw him out of the corner of his eye, red-faced with heat and rage, step over to a prisoner. He prodded him hard between the shoulder blades, so the wretch hefted his axe and squared up to a tree, and the others bent to their inept chopping and chipping. One tall fellow in a suit of striped slops, much too small for him, the trousers up around his calves, the sleeves almost at his elbows, the jacket gaping open on his massive chest, dabbed at the ground with his pick. He was moving fast enough to avoid Wyatt's stick, but making no impact on the stump he was attacking. Next to him, a man with the hollow cheeks of toothlessness grubbed away at another stump. Rook saw how each blow of his pick struck a root and bounced, but the man did not try another spot, lifting the pick, bringing it down, taking the recoil in his scrawny arms. Stupidity, Rook wondered, or indifference. For Major Wyatt, the grubbing out of a stump was a step on the way to a parade ground. For this man, it must be a task as pointless, as punitive, as the treadmill in the prison he had been plucked from. Thank God for astronomy, he thought, and kept walking. It seemed he was not the only officer keeping out of the way of duties. Away from the work parties, Silk was sitting on a rock, scribbling in a notebook and smiling to himself. When he saw Rook, he moved over hospitably. "The natives seemed at a loss to know of what sex we were," he read aloud, which having understood, they burst into the most immoderate fits of laughter. "You missed that encounter, Rook, but is it not entertaining in the greatest degree? We had one of the sailors give a visual demonstration of the truth, by chance an individual supremely equipped for the task. The natives were so astonished that I am sorry to say they vanished again soon after. My puzzle now is to keep the humour of that extraordinary encounter while finding the words for it which will not bring a blush to a maiden's cheek." "Yes, excellent," Rook said, thinking I hope Silk does not put me in his book. But Silk did not hear any reservation in his friend's praise. "Odd, though, is it not, that the natives are avoiding us? Gardner told me that they approached him in the fishing boat yesterday. He gave them some fish, but they did not stay to chat. Word must have travelled, of the impressive equipment, you know, of the other man." But Silk had finished with that joke. "Rook, my friend, will you be good enough to help me?" "Help you? I do not mean with the writing, no, but I will not be able to be everywhere at once. There will be things you hear of, which I will miss. I look to you as a friend." He touched Rook's arm. "Will you do that, old fellow? Will you help me make my narrative a sparkling gem of a thing before which Mr. Debrett will bow down in praise?" Rook was surprised by the nakedness of the appeal. He had never seen anything matter to Silk. Nothing, except perhaps Private Truby on the deck of Resolution, was more than material for an anecdote. He saw that for Silk, as for himself, New South Wales was not simply 4 years of full pay and the chance of advancement. and that evading the more unsavoury duties of their profession was not the only imperative. For Silk, as for himself, the place promised other riches. New South Wales was part of a man's destiny. Shipboard life did not prepare a man for scrambling up a hillside that was like a French pastry, and halfway up the promontory on the west side of the cove, Rook paused. It was partly to catch his breath, but partly to look down at where Sirius, his home for most of the past year, was already a miniature below him. He heard the ship's bell over the glaring water, quaver, crotchet, quaver, crotchet, quaver, crotchet, quaver. 7 bells, 3:30. The timekeeper on board would be showing 5:30 in the morning. The clock on the mantelpiece in the parlour at Church Street would be showing the same time. The room would be dark, clenched tight with the dank chill of late winter. In this hard, empty light and breathless heat, it was difficult to believe. Upstairs, everyone would be asleep under heaped blankets. Anne would be curled under his eiderdown in the attic. "I will keep it warm for you," she had promised, "and undertake to return it on condition that you come back safe." For an instant he felt it, just how far he was from home. He was weary at the thought of the officers' mess on Sirius, and yet another evening meal there. All those faces were known too well, and the voices that could only utter words he had heard 10 dozen times before. In the congestion of the ship, he had perfected the art of creating a bubble of mathematics that no one quite dared to burst. Until there were enough tents and huts, he would have to continue to live on board. But an astronomer was obliged to be close to his instruments at all hours of the night, so as soon as he could, he would remove to the promontory. From the end of the point the view was worth the climb. To the east the bright waters of the harbour went out towards the sea, serrated by so many headlands, so many inlets, a few islands. To the west were more headlands, more inlets, more islands. Just before the end of the ridge dropped away to the water, there was a level place about the size of Major Wyatt's parade ground, backed by a low cliff. No trees obscured the sky. The Royal Observatory at Greenwich must once have been just such a high open hilltop. As a crow might fly, the settlement was less than a mile distant, but this spot felt remote. Rook could not see the encampment, only hear the distant clunk of axes and the occasional shout. The person he was among those people, Second Lieutenant Rook, good with numbers although inclined to be awkward with people, was someone he inhabited like a stiff suit of clothes. To stand here, where the solitude without matched the solitude within, was to be unburdened. A man on this promontory would be part of the settlement, but not in it, present but forgotten. Astronomy would make a convenient screen for a self that he did not choose to share with any of the other souls marooned along with him. The wind had fallen away. The western horizon was sliding up to meet the sun, making the port a sheet of soft gold patched with the shapes of headlands and islands. Rook was turning to go back to the settlement when he realized that he was being watched. 2 native men were standing a short distance away, as still as the rocks, men whose dark skin made them part of the landscape. They were not looking at him, but out at the water. He remembered the men he had greeted on the first day, and the way they had reacted to Sergeant Waymark's pistol. Rook thought its power might have been more eloquent than Waymark intended. This seemed another chance. "Good afternoon! Good afternoon!" He took a few steps towards them. "I am pleased to meet you." That was absurd, but at least it was words. One man shifted the spear in his hand fractionally. Neither of the natives acknowledged by the slightest flicker of expression that a man was calling out that he was pleased to meet them. When they began to move towards him, he thought that they were responding at last. They were not. They walked past, an arm's length away, for all the world as if he were invisible. "Hoi," he thought of saying. "Hoi, I am here, you know." He even opened his mouth to speak, rehearsing the tone he would try for, amused, light, cheerful. But something about the dignified way they walked kept him silent. Where the rocks dropped away to the water, the two men stepped down. Rook could see that they had no sense of deliberating how to descend, thinking this way or that way. Their path was as familiar to them as Rook's had been beside the round tower. He went to the edge and looked down. One of the men was lying on a rock, with his face almost in the water, spear over his shoulder. The other had waded in knee-deep, and as Rook watched, he darted his spear with a movement too quick to see, and held it up with a shining fish flapping on the prongs. He flipped it off, broke its spine in his hands, and tucked it into the cord around his hips. Rook was ready to give a congratulatory wave, but the man only bent back towards the water. Why had he not spoken up when they passed so close? A different sort of fellow, Gardner for instance, or Silk, would not have let himself be ignored. Silk would be down there with them on the rocks, trying his hand with the spear, probably, and taking notes. When they came back up, he would not be shy. He would stand in their way until they stopped and would offer them something, his handkerchief perhaps. "Good afternoon," he would say again, right into their faces. They would not be able to pretend no one was there. "Good afternoon," he would say, and hold out the handkerchief. "Would you care to accept this?" But as he continued to watch the men, they moved around the point towards the next bay and out of sight without once glancing up. Rook was taken aback when the governor resisted the idea of him establishing an observatory. "The stars will have to wait, Mr. Rook," he snapped. "Dr. Vickery will understand that we have more urgent matters to attend to here." Rook watched his brows drawing together, creating two deep grooves. He had not prepared for this. On Sirius, he had been an astronomer, alongside the governor in the cabin with Mr. Kendall's timekeeper. But on land, he had to recognize that things were different. "Hear me on this, Lieutenant. I have more than 1,000 souls for whom I am responsible, and so far nothing but a few tents to offer them by way of shelter." The governor was turning away. "But, sir, you will remember that the Astronomer Royal has provided instruments, on the basis that they will be used in the furtherance of science. In particular, the comet which Dr. Vickery has predicted later this year, which he considers of the highest degree of importance." The governor seemed as surprised as Rook at this fluent speech, and looked at him dourly. "I would not wish to take issue with the Astronomer Royal. That is certainly true. But why so far, Lieutenant? My wish is that the settlement remain compact for the security of all its members. Until we can establish an intercourse with the natives, we have no way of knowing their intentions." He was turning away again, but Rook could not yield. He must have that lonely headland. Desperation gave his mind wings, his mouth words. "With the greatest respect, sir." That was a useful phrase he had heard Silk use with the governor to good effect. "An observatory must be in a position of perfect darkness for its best operation, as you would know." This was two kinds of lie. The first being, as you would know. The governor, an adequately competent Navy man, knew enough of the night sky to get a ship from one place to another, but nothing whatever of the needs of an astronomer. And the business of perfect darkness, well, that was at best a half-truth. The fires and flickering lamps of the settlement would hardly interfere with anyone's view of the stars. Rook watched the governor's narrow face, peevish but thoughtful. He was about to use his authority and simply forbid. In addition, sir," Rook said quickly, hoping that some further argument would come to him as he spoke. "In addition, sir, the calculations are difficult, particularly regarding a comet, for someone of my abilities, limited abilities." Rook could hear how his words laboured. He sometimes thought that he arrived at a sentence the way other people did multiplication, the hard way by adding. He felt himself colouring, but floundered on. "Distraction, sir. Distraction will tax my powers to the limit. Solitude and quiet will be essential." That was no half-truth, but a simple lie. He knew it, and the governor knew it too. The great cabin on Sirius had never offered solitude or quiet. At one end of the chart table, Rook would be calculating the ship's longitude with the aid of Dr. Vickery's almanac and the requisite tables. At the other end, the midshipmen would be doing their navigation lessons. By the window, the Commodore would be at his own desk with his papers and charts. In the corner, there might be an animated discussion between a couple of officers about, for instance, the respective merits from a culinary point of view of the various fish that the sailors were catching off the side. Rook could be called on for his opinion and give it without missing a beat in his calculations. The governor, isolated both by his position and, Rook thought, his temperament, might have understood a man who enjoyed his own company best of all, but to allow him that enjoyment could look like an indulgence, and indulgence to one officer would open him to trouble from others. The governor put his thumb under his chin and caressed his lip with a forefinger. Rook could feel him performing a brief but complex calculation, one in which the need to demonstrate his authority against this mulish junior lieutenant was set against the future usefulness of a cooperative one. Rook felt a flush of panic. Gilbert was nothing more than a naval captain of unremarkable talents, older but less gifted than himself. How was it that he could stand between a man and his proper life? "Very well, Lieutenant Rook. Have your headland. Let the Astronomer Royal get his comet. But let me warn you. At the first sign of trouble you will be recalled. We are not so lavishly supplied with men. There may be a time when every musket is needed, and Lieutenant—" he lowered his voice. "Speaking of that, I wish you to ensure that your weapon is loaded at all times." Then a private came bustling up, and that was the end of the interview. Out of sight of the governor, Rook stopped and laid a hand on his cheek, hot with the bitter flame of what he had so nearly lost. Squeaked through, that was his thought, a narrow squeak. What squeaking? Why squeaking? It was a relief to wonder about the silly phrase, rather than what would have happened if the governor had said, "I regret, Lieutenant, but my decision is final. Kindly do not ask again." He must remember how fragile his position was. There might be a destiny awaiting him here, but the governor was not interested in it. If he knew what was in his lieutenant's mind, he would remind him that he was not a man of science, an astronomer of the fairest promise, but just another of the governor's subjects. Unlike Greenwich, an Antipodean observatory could not boast a majestic building with every convenience for an astronomer. The best approximation Rook could devise was a small room surmounted by a cone of wood and canvas, something like an Indian tepee. The cone would have a long slit to accommodate the telescope, and its vertex would be a little off-centre to allow observations at the zenith. It looked peculiar on his sketch, and he thought it would be peculiar when built. But there was a sharp pleasure in reinventing the idea of an observatory from first principles. Major Wyatt took the view that he could not be expected to pander to every whim. He did not spell out whether the whim was the lieutenant's or the governor's, but eventually he let Rook have some men. They panted and scrambled up the ridge with the canvas and the poles for the tent that was to be Rook's temporary home, with the bed and the table and the boxes of instruments. Explaining his sketch to the carpenter, Rook referred to the tepee as the dome. Perhaps dome was a little grand. He tried to explain why the cone had to be off-centre, went into detail about the need for the instruments to point straight up. He tried to use commonplace words, but he caught an astonished look in the man's eyes. To speed the business along, Rook laboured beside the others. A pick was awkward, he discovered, and his hand blistered from its rough wood. But unlike the prisoners, he enjoyed his experience of heavy labour. Concentrating on striking the rock at just the right spot, with just the right force, at just the right angle, he worked himself into a pleasantly mindless state. The observation room was constructed on the top of the low cliff because of the solid base of rock it offered for the instruments. The hut for his own living quarters was below, connected to it by steps cut into the rock. Those steps, so simple to sketch, took the men twice as long as everything else put together. That was the difference between Euclid's world and the actual one. What with the rain and the men being called away for other duties, it took months to get the thing finished. The awkward angles of timber and the puckered whitewashed canvas nailed to the dome gave the place an improvised look. The carpenter's pride was offended by the way the off-centre peak of the tepee looked as if he had made a mistake. The slit where the telescope would travel up and down showed its rough edges, and the shutter that covered it was a crude thing of battens and canvas. He went away grumbling. Rook set his folding table on the floor of his living quarters and pushed his 2 chairs up to it. He arranged on the one and only shelf his razor, his pen and ink, and his few books. He set up his stretcher in the corner, spread the blanket out, put on the pillow the Montaigne that had been Anne's farewell gift, and wedged the candle holder into a crack in the wall for bedtime reading. In the dark corner behind the door he leaned his musket, the powder and shot hanging in their bags from a peg above it. The carpenter had given him a window, or at least left a hole in the wall with a wooden shutter. Sitting at his table, Rook looked out over the area of rock and tufts of grass that was now his front yard. Beyond that the land dropped away to the water, ruffled with the afternoon wind. A gull shot past, with one powerful beat of its wings, down and up. Over on the opposite shore, a wavering smudge of smoke rose above the trees. The planks of the hut let in a cool winter wind. The shingles of the roof were already splitting. The fireplace stones were insufficiently stuck together with poor mortar, and the floor bulged with elbows and knees of bedrock in spite of all Rook's work with the pick. But nowhere on the world's surface had ever meant as much to him. It was his own, as no place had ever been other than the attic in Church Street, and it was private. If he wanted to converse with himself, he could. He had forgotten the pleasure of thinking aloud. There was no one here to judge, no one to remind him that being ordinary was hard work. He felt as if he had been compressed, like a limb squeezed with a tourniquet. For all those years of school and shipboard life, now at last he could expand to fill whatever space was proper to him. Out here, with his thoughts his only company, he could become nothing more or less than the person he was. Himself. It was as unexplored a land as this one. Dr. Vickery had predicted that his comet would return in the latter part of 1788, which was still some months distant. The comet would justify the existence of the astronomer, but in the meantime it was important to be seen as a conscientious man of science. From their boxes, Rook got out the meteorological instruments that the Royal Observatory had provided, the thermometers from the Royal Society, the barometer, the anemometer, the specially constructed funnel and bottle for measuring rainfall. He was glad Dr. Vickery could not see the instruments in their new setting. The Astronomer Royal would never need to know that the barometer and thermometer, the most advanced objects of their kind in Europe, hung from rope under the eaves of a hut as rough as a pig shed. He would never see the rain gauge sitting on the stump of a tree sawn off as level as could be managed, let alone know that the same stump performed the office of dressing table. It was a pleasure that Rook would have to enjoy alone, that his life and his work were so little separate that if he wished, he could conduct his researches whilst shaving. All Dr. Vickery would see were the ledgers in which the readings would be entered. They would represent a miracle of translation. The language of muddle, of wobble, of improvisation would be transformed into exactitude. It was a shame, Rook thought, that Dr. Vickery could not share his delight in that transformation. Winds, weather, barometer, thermometer, remarks. Perhaps rashly, Rook ruled up 6 observation times for every day, between 4 in the morning and 8 at night. It was like the beginning of a grand enterprise to dip his pen in the ink and write up the first readings. June 24, 1788. Wind, south-southwest, 4 knots. Weather, heavy cloud and hazy. Barometer 29, thermometer 60. Remarks. About 700 hours, it began to rain, and soon after the barometer rose. Up the 4 lopsided steps from his living quarters, there was barely enough space in the observation room for one slender astronomer, and the canvas of the roof crackled distractingly in the wind. But the rock on which the quadrant stood had never been moved since the foundation of the world. Under his feet he could feel it, unmediated by floorboards or rug, the sphere of rock, spinning through space and time, taking himself and his instruments with it. Through the telescope the stars burned with a foreign clarity, explosively brilliant, living things pulsing in the blackness. For now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. He thought Paul must have been a man who had lain flat on his back on the ground and looked up at just such a sky as this. Rook knew the southern constellations now as well as those he had grown up with. All the way down the curve of the globe from Portsmouth to New South Wales, he had watched them night by night, creeping further up over the southern horizon, but at sea he had never seen them so bright. The moon was crisp against the black sky, its seas and mountains as clear as if etched, upside down of course, from the point of view of someone looking out of the window of a parlour in misty Portsmouth. He could have drawn that parlour, every crease in the tablecloth, every stain on the armchair, the place where the fringe of the rug was fraying. He could have told you how, at this moment, noon there more or less, and summer of course, his father would be drawing his napkin out of his napkin ring, and his mother would be slicing the bread and handing it to Anne to butter, and Bessie would be putting it on their plates, all of them suppressing the rumbling of their insides, impatient for the servant girl to bring in the midday meal. It was as real as that. He did not have to imagine the hunger, as the governor had them on short rations until the promised supply ships arrived from England. Yet it was also not real at all. A story someone had told him long ago about people in a dream. From his stretcher, he could hear the waters of the port, the restless sound coming in the window hole. The water was never still, always in conversation with itself and with the shore. He could hear it slapping up against the rocks at the foot of the point, knew how it must look, washing foamily into crannies. Nothing prevented a drop of that water from making in reverse the same voyage that he had. That drop could travel along the currents until it arrived at the mother bank and slide past the round tower. It could splash up at last on the hard, just where the tender from Sirius had pushed off, with Daniel Rook aboard a year before. It would leave a dark hieroglyph on one of the stones, a greeting from the far side of the globe to the world he had left behind. Even after he took up residence in the observatory, Rook joined the other officers for the Sunday dinner. He thought of it as a tithe of gratitude for not having to dine there on the other days. One evening, in the settlement's first winter, he arrived at the barracks, a long dark hut with an incongruously splendid mahogany table almost filling the space, to see the governor there at its head alongside Major Wyatt. It was an honour His Excellency paid now and again to his officers rather than dine alone in his own residence. Major Wyatt always thanked him fulsomely. As far as the rest of them were concerned, the governor's presence made for careful conversation. Rook installed himself between Silk and young Lieutenant Timpson, and he hoped out of the line of sight of Major Wyatt and the governor. Timpson was tedious, inveighing against the women prisoners, all damned whores in his view, and forever bringing out the miniature of his sweetheart, expecting wonderment and admiration from other men. He was too young and artless to know that another man's sweetheart in an oval frame was of limited interest. Silk's opinion of young Lieutenant Timpson was that he protested too much. "Mark my words, Rook," Silk had said. "We will be seeing him with us at Mrs. Butcher's before the end of the year, and we'll hear no more of this Betsy." Rook was inclined to agree. Mrs. Butcher had kept an establishment in Devizes, apparently, and knew how to run a good house. Sometimes with Silk and sometimes alone, Rook had visited her hut and found her to be both hospitable and discreet, offering the choice of several pleasant convict girls and the privacy of a canvas curtain. Timpson's innocent prudery was tedious, but Rook was happy to admire Betsy for the 100th time and agree what a sweet and dear face she had, if it allowed him to take his place in the furthest and most dimly lit corner of the room. At the head of the table, The governor and Wyatt sat glumly as the boys set their plates of food in front of them. Silk broke the silence. "Ah, the daily diabolical morsel!" It was a risk, Rook thought, to draw attention to what was on each plate, but the governor went so far as to laugh. Wyatt followed, and the whole table joined in. Only Silk could have got away with it, but he had judged well. Men confronted with yet another insufficient meal of elderly salt beef and a spoonful of peas porridge were glad of any distraction. His Majesty's victualler had assumed that New South Wales would produce at least some of the food its colonists needed, but this had proved to be optimistic. The heart of the mop-like tree was called cabbage, although Rook thought it as fibrous and probably as tasty as oakum. Various sparse greens grew by the stream, and the leaves of a sprawling vine had been found to make a faintly sweet tea which he had come to savour. That was the extent of the vegetable production of the place. Gardens had been planted, but what with the grubs, soil that was no better than sand, and theft by prisoners, no turnip or potato had ever grown bigger than a marble. Now and then the governor's shooter brought back game from the woods. His Excellency was generous in sharing it with his officers, and Rook, like the others, had relished the various unrecognisable joints of tough but tasty meat. No part of the creatures was wasted, since Surgeon Waymark paid the shooter for the heads. Rook had seen Waymark's watercolours, the stump where the kangaroo or opossum neck had been hacked off with a hatchet, cunningly hidden in the picture by a spray of foliage. But the fact remained, supplies were running short. The mess cook spread the food out as he served it to make it look more substantial. To Rook, the stratagem suggested an interesting calculation. How large a circle could be made with a given quantity of peas and salt beef? But whether thin or thick, whatever diameter its circle, and no matter how interesting the problem involving pie, the food was insufficient, because the supply ships were nowhere to be seen. "Those buggers have forgotten us," Timson said sotto voce to Rook, running a finger around his plate and sucking at it. "Spat us out and said good riddance, or else the ships are all wrecked. Wish to God I had not volunteered." It was Timson's first appointment, and he had not yet learned to hide his homesickness. As he ate, he was inclined to dream aloud of his favourite meals, especially his mother's hot pot with braised leeks. Rook, too, had caught himself daydreaming about a dish of new potatoes with butter and parsley and salt, and a nice fresh mutton chop to go with it. Around the table, on which every plate soon gleamed, Rook thought there was not a single man who believed that His Majesty's new settlement would last. It was only a matter of whether they all starved first. At the end of the meal, the governor rose in his place, looking so spindly and angular that Rook was put in mind of Newton's mathematical bridge. "Good evening, gentlemen, and my thanks for your hospitality." He glanced down at his plate and hesitated as if regretting the ironic possibilities of the remark. "It is my intention to take a party of men into the hinterland. I hope to locate whatever it might offer that could be turned to account." Turned to account? They all knew the fact behind that fine turn of phrase. Nothing will grow at Sydney Cove, and our store is running out. I am confident also that we will fall in with natives more prepared to parley with us than those we have encountered here. Rook thought of those two men who had walked past him as if he were a rock or a bush. Every day his first act was to go outside and see if they had returned. The governor stretched his face into his approximation of a smile. "I wonder whether any of you gentlemen would care to be of the party." Rook did not stop to think, jumped to his feet. "Lieutenant Rook, sir, I will go." Birds, mammals, ants and their habitations. This was his chance to see more of New South Wales than the speck of it he was so far familiar with. And if there should be an opportunity to parley, who better to do it than a man who knew 5 languages? Silk was only a little behind. "Captain Silk also, sir, at your service," he called out. At your service. That was a better form of words. Rook tucked it away, less like a schoolboy than I will go. He felt himself blushing, but no one was watching. "Thank you, gentlemen. I am obliged to you." After the meal, Silk hung back. "My word, Rook! I thought myself the quickest jack-in-the-box in the regiment, but I see I must not be complacent." Rook tried to frame a reply, but Silk did not wait. "Prickles, sunburn mosquitoes, and I doubt not snakes. Perhaps unfriendly natives too. However, the worse of it is to experience, the better it will read on the page. The natives are what I need. Their shyness is disappointing. This expedition may provide an opportunity to chat to the elusive fellows. And whatever other outcomes, we will have brought a little favourable attention on ourselves." He winked. "The long view, my friend. Never lose sight of the long view of our time in New South Wales." The long view was hard to keep sight of when faced with New South Wales 1 yard at a time. Rook sat in the cutter with the rest of the party, hearing the dip and suck of the oars as the sailors propelled them along the harbour towards the west. In the bow, the governor had a thwart to himself, peering with his telescope. Silk sat alertly behind him, now and then leaning forward to respond to some remark from the governor that Rook could not hear. Beside Silk, Lieutenant Wilstead also leaned forward, his bony face eager, trying to make his mark. Wilstead had been on Sirius. All the way across the Atlantic, all the way across the great Southern Ocean, Rook had watched him trying in vain to make his mark with the governor. His ambition was too naked on his lean face, his ingratiating smile too much a matter of mechanics. Silk had just as much ambition, but did not seem to care. And when the governor turned on his thwart to comment on some point of interest, it was always to Silk that he spoke. Behind Rook sat 2 privates on either side of a big bearded prisoner. The governor's shooter, Silk had told Rook, brought along to bag them their suppers. He was like a haunch of beef himself, Rook thought, his massive shoulders all of a piece with his powerful neck. He met the man's eyes, shrewd, knowing, sceptical. Lieutenant Gardner of Sirius was in charge of the boat. He balanced himself in the stern while the sailors laboured over the oars, steering them up the harbour. On the northern shore, high dark prows of headlands hung over the water, the sombre woods pressing down into their own reflections. To the south the land was lower, each bay and promontory shining with the glossy leaves of mangroves. Now and then between them, a crescent of yellow sand was like a punctuation mark. Gulls bobbing on the water turned their heads to watch the boat pass. Pelicans seemed to smile to themselves. The tide was behind the boat, sweeping it around bend after bend, the banks narrowing until what had been a harbour became a river. They rounded a long, low promontory and found themselves sliding past a slope of grass on which 4 or 5 natives sat around a fire, staring at the boat. They were like a tableau being dragged across a stage. And of course, from the point of view of the natives, the boat full of staring strangers must be a tableau sliding through their field of view. "Turn in, Lieutenant," the governor called along the boat to Gardner. "Back oars and bring us into them." He stood up in the bow as the boat drew closer, took off his hat and waved it. "Good morning," he shouted. "Good morning, friends." The natives did not wave back. As Rook watched, the tableau moved, and a woman rose from beside the fire, scooping up a child against her breast, and walked away into the bushes. One by one the others got up and followed her. They did not seem to be hurrying, but by the time the boat was close enough to land, the clearing was empty. "Shall I jump ashore, sir?" Wilstead asked. "I could jump ashore, sir, and go after them." But there was something about Wilstead's voice that the governor could not seem to hear. "Row on, Lieutenant Gardner," he called, an edge in his voice. "We will not waste time here." The river narrowed to a stream, winding between deep banks, and finally their way was blocked by flat slabs of rock piled up in shelves down which water tinkled and shone. "Terminus, gentlemen," Gardner called, and backed the boat in to where one of the slabs of rock fell away into deep water. Wilstead and Silk got out and turned to help the governor, but he was getting his angles and joints out over the gunwale with considerable dexterity. "Thank you, gentlemen, but as you see, I am already here." He looked up at the steep banks on either side, scoured to bare rock in places by past floods, and was already setting off while he gave orders over his shoulder. "Thank you, Lieutenant Gardner. I will expect you at this spot in 3 days' time. Now, Captain Silk, come alongside me if you please. We will lead the way. Lieutenant Wilstead, will you be good enough to come after us? Lieutenant Rook, be so kind as to bring up the rear and record our line of march. Sergeant, you and the privates will march with the gamekeeper." Rook laughed, thinking the governor had made one of his rare witticisms, but he turned in his angled way and fixed him with a cold eye. Rook coughed into his hand. Gamekeeper. The word suggested the society that Lancelot Percival James had boasted of at the academy. Pheasants and deer in a park artfully planted to enhance the prospect, cheerful peasantry tipping their caps to the squire riding by. But New South Wales was no gentleman's estate. His Majesty's subjects were perched in a small sour clearing on the edge of the unknown. The land around them seemed without resources, either animal or vegetable, and the gamekeeper was a criminal who had been given a gun. The party fell in behind the governor. From the rear, Rook could see the line of knapsacks bobbing along, and the heads bowed to avoid the whippy bushes. The prisoner, taller than anyone else, his powerful frame half bursting out of his threadbare check shirt, shouldered through everything in his path. He carried the governor's knapsack as well as his own, but they sat on his back like baubles. The governor's announced aim had been to strike due west, but the party needed constantly to diverge north or south to avoid muddy creeks too wide to cross and impenetrable thickets where shrubs had engulfed fallen trees. They climbed down ravines full of creepers that caught around their ankles and hauled themselves up the steep rocky slopes on the other side, from which they could see only another ravine. At the back of the line, Rook had a compass in one hand and notebook in the other, his pencil behind his ear, counting his paces and noting each change of direction. He had ruled up the pages beforehand: number of paces, direction of march. As he scrawled in the columns, he decided that the words march and direction did not do justice to the reality. The place flowed past, a blur of namelessness. Tree, another tree, bush, another sort of bush, white flower, yellow flower, red flower. To be unable to give things their proper names was to be like a child again. He remembered himself on the shingle below the round tower, crouching over his pebble collection, big one, small one, light one, dark one. The governor called a halt for the night beside a stream fringed with tall reeds. Rook sat down and peeled off the knapsack, stuck to his back with sweat that was cooling unpleasantly as the evening chill came over the woods. He watched as the sergeant reluctantly gave the prisoner a gun and a bag of shot. The man took the musket, like a toy in his enormous hand, and hefted the bag of shot in a practised way. He smiled from behind his beard, his lips rosy. "You want supper, sir? It will want to be a damn sight more shot than that," he said. "Mind your tongue, man," the sergeant was beginning, but the governor called out, "It is all right, Sergeant. Bragdon is to have whatever he needs." The sergeant's mouth became a compressed line as he doled out another handful of shot. Bragdon grinned, showing powerful white teeth. "Thank you, Sergeant," he said. "Thank you so very much indeed, sir." The sergeant watched him go, swaggering along the creek, the gun over his shoulder, his shadow long on the grass. On the hulks, Rook thought, the man would not have been allowed even a pocket-knife for cutting his bread. The sour-faced sergeant looked as though he were thinking the same thing. The governor saw Rook watching the man stride off. "When in Rome, Mr. Rook," he said. "I know Bragdon from home. He was a gamekeeper for the Duke of Portland before he unfortunately fell foul of the law. He's a rough sort of fellow, but I have seen him hit a wood-pigeon at 100 paces. "But, sir, if he wanders," Wilstead suggested. The governor gave him a wry look. "Yes, Lieutenant Wilstead, if he wanders. Can you tell me where you think he might get to?" Wilstead blinked but had no answer. Rook sat down on a log and got out his notebook to tot up the paces and compass bearings. Thinking he might find it useful in the wilderness, he had paced out along Church Street, Portsmouth, Anne running beside him with the chalk, marking each step. The average length of stride of Lieutenant Daniel Rook was 33 inches. Here, stumbling, climbing and creeping by turns, such precision was irrelevant. Like Euclid, he would begin with an assertion, and since he was inventing, he might as well make the arithmetic simple. Let each pace be 36 inches. When he had tallied everything up, he marked their line of march on the sketch map of the place. It was a strange zigzag, like the path of a beetle, rather than a detachment of the King's armed forces. He got up to take it to the governor, but Silk intercepted him. "How many miles, Rook? How far to the west?" Rook pointed at where his zigzag line ended. "By my reckoning, we are 4 5/8 miles southwest of the place we disembarked," he said. 4 5/8? My word, you're a marvel, Lieutenant." Silk turned to Wilstead, who had his shoes and spatterdashes off, and was sitting on a fallen log, touching delicately at his blisters. "Look, Wilstead, can you believe it? Rook can put us exactly here." Silk placed his finger with finicking exactness on the spot where the dotted line ended. Wilstead barely looked at the paper. "My word," he said. "Well done, Rook." He did not try to conceal that his blisters were of more interest to him than a mark on a sheet of paper. Silk watched him, his mouth rather set, his chin somewhat drawn in. It was the look he had when Rook answered a question too exhaustively. Exasperation was the word to describe it, Rook thought, though Silk was too genial and too gentlemanly to do more than this hardly visible tightening of a few muscles. "Thank you, Rook," he said warmly, as if making up for Wilstead's indifference. "I find it steadying to be able to locate myself so precisely." He glanced around at the bushes pressing down the slope towards them, so that Rook wondered whether it was really praise or a subtle mockery. Leaving the others, he paced along the bank of the stream with the compass in his hand. Establishing the course of the tributary, he explained to some imaginary questioner, taking advantage of the last of the light. When he pushed aside a bush to get down to the water, a duck burst up from under his feet. He leaped back in fright. It fluttered along and skidded onto the water, quacking with a sound like laughter. "Heck, heck, 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 heck!" A play so strange took a layer of skin off a man and left him peeled. He made a show of noting the way the stream hooked to the north, but the reality was that he wanted simply to be able to see what was around him. Unrelenting newness made for something like blindness. It was as if sight did not function properly in the absence of understanding. Without his pack and his notebook, he hoped that his eyes might begin to make distinctions among all those trees and bushes. The grass by the stream was tender in the thickening dusk, sucking up the horizontal rays of the sun and turning a green so bright it seemed liquid. Beside the stream the fir trees drooped. Firs. It was what everyone called them. But when he pulled off a spray of the needles, he saw that, unlike a fir's, they were jointed, the knuckles packed together more closely at the tip. What leaf grew like a telescope, pushing itself out segment by segment? He had wanted strangeness. Well, this place was strange beyond comprehension. The gamekeeper came back just before dark with a brace of parrots and an opossum. His time in the woods had energized him. "Not much by way of game, sir," Rook heard him telling the governor. "But if it moves, sir, well, then I shoot it." Brugden was flushed with satisfaction, watching with pride as one of the privates dealt with the feathers and fur. The creatures made a stew of sorts that was hardly enticing, but helped the small ration of hard old bread along. After the meal, Rook, like everyone else, was glad to roll himself into his blanket. His thighs quivered from the day of remorseless up and down. He had been bitten by 1,000 insects, and the blanket was insufficient against the cold of the night. But as sleep descended, the thought came to him, "There is nowhere in the world that I would rather be." They had left the river behind on their journey west, but on the second day they found it again. Along the bank a path had been worn by feet before theirs. "Ah, the governor exclaimed. "At last we may meet some natives." Rook wondered how an exchange might begin. By going forward and offering words, he supposed. That first day on the beach, he should have tried fewer trinkets and more words. He had missed another opportunity the day those two men had passed his hut. He would not miss a third chance. He rehearsed it. The laying down of the musket, the stepping towards them with empty hands outstretched. He would not wait for the governor. He would take the initiative. But then, how would the dialogue start? No natives appeared to put the question to the test, but 134 paces later they saw trees bleeding red sap from fresh scars. 207 paces further brought them to a cluster of native huts and a smouldering fire. "They cannot be far away," Wilstead said. "That is perfectly true, Lieutenant," the governor replied. "What a shame it is that we do not know in which direction." The bushes and trees around them could have hidden an army. "Where are they?" the governor demanded irritably. "Why do they hide from us?" Wilstead took it on himself to answer. "I imagine, sir, that they are waiting to see how we declare ourselves. When they understand our peaceable intentions, they will approach." But the governor was too exasperated to want soft soap. "But when, Mr. Wilstead? When might they condescend to speak with us?" The river widened, and the land on either side curved upwards more gently. The undergrowth gone, the trees standing apart from each other among grass. Here, as nowhere else, the idea of a gentleman's park was not altogether ridiculous. The governor called a halt. "Captain Silk, the trowel, if you please." He dug up a handful of dark dirt and made a fist around it, inspecting the crumbling ball he produced. He peered, he sniffed. Was he going to taste it? Silk, standing solemnly by the trowel, caught Rook's eye with a droll expression. "Lieutenant Rook," the governor said, turning so that Silk had to rearrange his face. "Would you be so good as to note the location of this spot? It is my view that this soil would reward cultivation." Rook got out his notebook and compass, took bearings from a nearby hill, drew a line representing the river, and generally made a big work of establishing where they were. "I am obliged to you, Lieutenant," the governor said, and favoured him with one of his squeezed smiles. That evening, Brugden was again given the gun and shot, and boasted that this time he would bring back something better than a possum. "Put your minds at rest, gentlemen," he announced to Rook and Wilstead as he set off. "If there is anything worth eating out there, I promise you it will not get away. If it moves, well then, by God, I shoot it." He swaggered off with the gun over his shoulder. "My mind was not especially agitated in point of fact," Wilstead muttered to Rook. "That fellow has been given too much latitude in my view." He watched Brugden go with a sourness he did not try to hide. Half an hour later, as they sat by the fire, they heard the retort of a distant gun. "Dinner, I imagine," Silk said. But a short time later, there was a tremendous crashing down the hillside, and Brugden burst out of the bushes, cap falling over one ear, his beard full of leaves, and a humid, swollen look to one eye. "The buggers stoned me!" he bellowed. "Saving your presence, sir, but the damn buggers stoned me!" He held out an arm, showing a swollen red graze. The governor was not interested in the man's arm. "What happened, Brugden?" he snapped. "Quick to it now and tell me straight!" At this Rook thought the prisoner looked a little shifty. He struck Rook as a man with a sharp assessment of where his own interests lay. I never did nothing, sir," he said. "I was just walking along. I got a couple of crows. I was just taking a bead on one of them opossums. Then I got a stone smack in the back, another on the arm here. The bushes was that thick I couldn't see nothing, sir. Not one thing." Like Rook, the governor seemed to hear too much protest in this. "And then? Did you shoot? Out with it, man!" Brugden's beard made it easy for him to hide the expression on his face. "They was coming for me. They had the spears and the cudgels. I felt my life to be in danger, sir." "So you did see them. Did you shoot?" Brugden avoided his gaze, rubbing at the place on his arm and another place on his neck. His eye was almost closed. "Yes, sir," he said truculently. "I fired among the thick of them, sir. If not, sir, I'd be a dead man." The governor looked at the ground as if tamping down rage. "So you fired. Did you wound? Did any fall?" "Why, sir, I fired and then I run. I could not say what happened. I let off the gun, then I ran like blazes. I had the fear of God in me, sir." "Brugden, I warned you, if you remember." The governor's voice was so soft that Rook had to lean in to hear. "I warned you. I told you, and now I will tell you once again. The survival of this settlement and all of its members depends in large degree on maintaining cordial relations with the natives. Do you understand, man? There are too few of us, and God knows how many of them." "Yes, sir," Brugden said. His rosy lips shaped the words like a small creature in the thicket of dark hair, then disappeared. The mood of the party shifted with Brugden's story. Rook saw the governor have a word with Silk, saw Silk have a word with the sergeant, saw one of the privates take up position as guard. The sergeant discreetly gathered up the guns and loaded them in the shadows beyond the fire, then brought them back and laid them in a row. Rook supposed he should be frightened. In their different ways, he thought the others were. Brugden was surly, groaning each time he moved, squinting through his closed-up eye. Wilstead got his stockings and shoes back on, and sat on a log by the fire, repeatedly clearing his throat like a man about to give his wedding speech. Silk slapped at the mosquitoes with larger gestures than necessary. "My God, they are the size of sparrows, I swear, even though you would think them discouraged by the cold," he exclaimed. "Rook, I have no doubt you hope for natural curiosities unknown to science, but frankly, my friend, wondrous though you no doubt find them, I would as soon forego the pleasure of their acquaintance." It was theatre, Rook thought, the lit-up clearing by the fire, a stage in which a performance was taking place entitled, perhaps, "His Majesty's Men Defy the Foe." He chewed through his ration, making it last. Even crow soup would have been welcome. Something had happened out there in the woods, about which Brugden was remaining silent. But if native warriors were planning to attack, a few muskets were not going to save them. Fear was what you felt when your actions could make a difference to what was about to happen. 8 men alone in this immensity of unknown could only wait and hope. It was an uneasy night, but an uneventful one. They woke to long, calm stripes of sunlight along the grass between the trees, and the carolling of birds welcoming the day. In sunlight, the row of loaded muskets seemed absurd. That day they closed off the ragged 3/4 circle they had described and made their way back to where they had disembarked. As they glimpsed the boat through the trees, the governor turned to Rook. "First-rate navigating, Lieutenant Rook. Well done." Gardner had the boat neatly backed into the shore. Rook watched him read the governor's face and see that the promised land of sweet pasture and talkative natives had not been found. He gave Rook a private grimace that said, "Rather you than me." Rook was pleased to be sitting in the boat taking his ease rather than stumbling along with his pack. But he had established himself as a first-rate navigator. That would not do him any harm at all, and that long blundering through a nameless land was like the first meeting with a stranger, a promise of something better to come. Silk had his pencil out and was jotting something down in his notebook and smiling at the words. Wilstead had managed to get himself beside the governor, but when the governor spoke, it was Silk he turned around to address. "That fertile area by the river is exactly what I hoped we might find," Rook heard him say. "It looks fair to become the breadbasket of the colony. Would you not say, Captain Silk?" "Indeed, sir," Silk said. "Very promising, a fair prospect indeed." He met Rook's glance, but with the governor next to him, even Silk did not dare wink. Brugden's eye was a regal shade of purple, and he had gone silent and grim. It was more than the pain, Rook thought. The man had been humiliated and would not forget it. This is the end of CD 2. The book continues on CD 3. Recklessly he turned over page after page of the notebook, heading each with a letter of the alphabet, as Lily had done. Native tongue to English, then again for English to native tongue. Now he took a second notebook, and on its flyleaf he wrote, "Grammatical forms of the language of New South Wales." Words were all very well, but with nothing more than words, one was forever a child, piping out the names of things. Grammar was the gearing that made them useful. To begin with, he would have to limit himself to actions that could be acted out: to eat, to go or walk, to drink, to yawn, to creep. Foreign they might be, but these people must walk and drink, eat and yawn and creep. He had better start modestly with the indicative mood. I eat, you eat, he, she or it eats. Nothing much could be communicated without a sense of past and future, so he had better try for that too. I will eat, you will eat, I have eaten, you have eaten, and of course he must gather the useful imperative, eat. On the left-hand side of the page he wrote the English. Beside each entry were the spaces that would be filled, word by systematic word, with the unknown tongue. He headed the page opposite the empty verb templates with a title he hoped might gather up some of what was missing, other inflections of the same verb. He laid the notebooks out side by side on the table. The vocabulary, the grammatical forms. The books were like the jaws of some ingenious machine. Between them, they would crack open the nut of this language. It would be an extraordinary task. Even Kepler, even Newton, had not been presented with a tabula rasa, but had built on other men's work. Unlike them, he would be setting off to meet the unknown with only his ears, his pen, and these little notebooks. Rook was aware of a tightness in his chest that was new to him. It took him some time to recognize that this was how it felt to be in the grip of a vision. Destiny was a grand word, but perhaps not too grand for what lay ahead. This is the end of CD 3. The book continues on CD 4. If he had been a man of the world, he would have seen how those words could be read. A man of the world would never have been so fatally innocent as to write them down. In Silk's mind, there could be no intimacy with a native girl that was not physical. And how can I hope to persuade him otherwise, Rook thought, when I myself do not understand and have no word for that intimacy? I should have known, he cursed himself, should have remembered his nose for a secret. He had lived in that place that seemed so different as to be inviolable. He had drifted along without time or space or consequence. Everything had been suspended while he and Tagaran floated in some corner of the cosmos in which the impossible could unfold. Now the iron laws of time and place were asserting themselves. Not speaking had made things worse. He could see that now, made it look furtive, when there was nothing to hide. They have an artless charm, the girls, I grant you, Silk said, and an admirable lack of coquetry. But Rook, as a friend, might I just utter a word of warning? Hidden away out here, you may not be completely aware. Well, the natives are. Let me put it this way, the governor is concerned. Those attacks at Rose Hill, you might think to go a little carefully. Thank you, Silk, Rook said. It is kind of you to speak as a friend. Kind. But what could Silk know, reading his words through a lens of prurience, and making guesses that were so wrong as to be sickening? He took the notebooks from Silk, got up and put them away on the shelf. Once up there between Lacaille's Stelliferum and the Nautical Almanac, they were invisible. So small, like the first snag in a stocking, that could hardly be detected, that seemed not to have any importance. By the time the snag had unravelled the whole thing, it was too late to mend. This is the end of CD4. The book continues on CD5.